All right, I have a show for you today that I think is absolutely going to open your eyes and blow your mind. I have with me today Ivan Raiklin. Ivan, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks, Stephen, for having me. Absolute
So,
honor.
yeah, so right now you're outside the courthouse for the Hunter Biden case. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I can change the camera angle real quick just so that your audience can realize that I'm not fibbing whatsoever. And if I know how to even change it, maybe I don't. Here we go. I got it. There you go. J. Caleb Boggs Federal Building, U.S. Courthouse, in its full glory.
Is Jill Biden there again today?
I didn't see her today.
Okay.
No, I didn't see her.
I had heard that she was there and the president was nearby and they were putting pressure on.
Yeah.
So very quickly, for my audience, you are a former Green Beret. You are
I like to say retired.
Yeah, retired. And one of the boldest individuals I've ever followed on the internet. You probably saw this. You probably saw this last night, but the Arizona GOP has sued the Secretary of State after discovering over 500,000 illegal voters on their voter rolls. Why do you think Arizona is trying to keep those fake voters on their rolls? And is this why they needed mail-in ballots? Because you can fake 500,000 letters, but you can't fake 500,000 people standing in line?
I mean, that's a kind of a big question because in order to contextualize it, you have to understand that due to the Fauci-funded Wuhan Institute of Virology lab incident, unknown if it was deliberate or accidental up to this point, resulted in 39 states running their elections not according to the state election laws. So that was one level of fraud and illegalities that took place. In addition to that, you have very dirty voter rolls in many jurisdictions, to include in Arizona. What I find disheartening is that the GOP in Arizona is playing defense, meaning they're responding to what's going on with the radical leftist domestic terrorist organization known as the Democrat Party. And so what they're doing is responding, if you will, to what the Democrats have already done. And what I'm referring to as it applies to Arizona specifically is that what most people don't understand is that the electors that are being criminalized in Arizona are downstream from what occurred on the January 6th, what I call the Mike Pence's beloved Liz Cheney and Nancy Pelosi's beloved Benny Thompson's January 6th Fedsurrection cover-up committee. When you frame it that way, you start to understand how everything plays into each other. Now, when you look at the committee itself, it was directed by a staff director, David Buckley, one of the 51 that provided cover for the Hunter Biden criminal syndicate laptop, one of the 51 spies who lied. That's why I'm here today, to continue to uncover that. So that staff director was appointed by this uniparty cabal to then create his and the uniparty's target list of patriots. It is now my turn to create the deep state target list and now go after them with maximum offense, lawfence, in the most peaceful, patriotic, legal, moral, and ethical manner available to mankind at the state level and at the county level. And it appears as though maybe my rhetoric, which has now been seen by tens of millions, is maybe motivating constituents to demand that their leaders, quote unquote, that are for the Constitution, to start taking bold action. And maybe that's what's happening in Arizona.
Okay. Speaking of bold action, you were sitting right behind Dr. Anthony Fauci while he testified under oath to Congress that he doesn't remember much.
He was sitting in front of me, blocking my view.
You know, he testified he doesn't remember much, that he didn't do much, that he didn't really play a part in so many people dying and our lives being upended. What was it like to sit in that courtroom, and is anything going to happen to Dr. Fauci?
So it wasn't a courtroom. It was actually in the United States House of Representatives. It was the Oversight Committee, but the subcommittee on the select subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic was the one that was meeting, chaired by Congressman Brad Wenstrup from Ohio. By the way, for those that didn't know, sitting at home, Brad Wenstrup was the congressman that gave a coin to Mike Pence on January 6th. Remember that sequence of events? If you don't know, take a look at it. Right at around 1 p.m. when the illegally conducted election was about to be certified, right before the gaveling of Pelosi and Pence, Brad Wenstrup, the chair of this subcommittee, went ahead and coined Mike Pence, which I presume, I guess we can make the assumption or inference that he is close with Mike Pence and was lauding him for his failed vice presidency. Okay. And so then what did the Uniparty do, in my opinion, my analytic assessment? They being probably the Paul Ryan wing of the party, to go ahead and have Brad Wenstrup be the limited hangout manager so that the COVID pandemic would be slow roll released into the 2024 election, covering up anybody that they wanted to protect from their involvement. And that person is the guy that ran the COVID task force in the White House, the guy that chaired it, a guy by the name of Mike Pence. His employees were Anthony Fauci and Debbie Burks. No one talks about Mike Pence's role. I do. Now, to answer your question more specifically, how was it while he was blocking my view as I was listening in to the questions being dealt to him as it relates to his role in the pandemic and his responses to the pandemic? Well, that wasn't important to me. What was important is hearing the audience before, during, and after his attempted testimony to be able to try to defend himself. In the crowd, you would hear at every moment that he spoke, and the camera that were there wouldn't pick up a lot of that. Some of the folks, I think, in the crowd were videotaping, but you could hear people saying liar at every single moment he took a breath. Liar, liar, like every sentence, liar. That's number one. Number two, several people stood up and said, you killed my grandmother. You killed my whatever relative it was. And then they ended up walking out. There's a false report out there by the legacy disinformation purveyors that says that the individual that was sitting right next to me was thrown out of the room. No, that's not how it works. He stood up and said, I've had enough, and then said, you need to be in jail, Fauci, as he walked out. So he wasn't escorted out. He voluntarily left because he was disgusted with his listening to the absolute perjurious lies that he was speaking out of his mouth in response to some of those members' questions and line of questioning, as well as another doctor sitting behind me, a woman that basically said the same thing. I would say that this was one instance where the crowd in that room demanded maximum retribution for that witness, of which the chairman of that committee is not in a position, due to either lack of courage because of his toxic, feckless, stone-cold cowardice, to do anything as it applies to Anthony Fauci, or because he is somehow complicit in being a recipient of many of those funds that are doled out by the big pharma companies known as the Pfizer fail, or the Moderna mutilation, or the J&J jab distributors. Because at the end of the day, we all know, based on CDC's own data and records under the VAERS system, vaccine adverse events reporting systems, that there are at a minimum 38,000 that were murdered as a result of these jabs. Minimum number that were reported. And then over 1 million that were the recipients of heart explosions, myocarditis, or some sort of adverse reaction.
Yeah, I'm personally dealing with health issues after getting the COVID variant back to back. So I would love to see some kind of accountability for Fauci. But like you say, the feckless leadership in Washington, D.C. is probably going to cover up for him, and we won't see much come out of that. You had mentioned that you're putting together a list of people.
I've already put that list together. Yeah.
Okay. Is this for Trump's DOJ and Attorney General to go after, or how do you round up those people?
I mean, if they want to participate, by all means, we'll take all the help we can get. But at the end of the day, 1 second. I'm on a show right now, sir. We'll talk later if you have a moment. Okay. Okay. It looks like I got a fan out here.
Okay.
So we'll see. I talk to everybody. Fans. I mean, I take comments, concerns, questions, insults, and attempted offenses, because it can never be offensive to me, because I never have fear or apprehension of harm, whether it's verbal or physical. Anyway, I digress. So, having said that, here's what I suspect regarding the DOJ. We all know that the DOJ and the FBI and the CIA is complicit in the destruction of our constitutional order. It is so clear for the world to see and hear, but for the critical thinkers like ourselves. But a good chunk of society has yet to be introduced to that information, because those very institutions were behind the censorship industrial complex. So in order to understand all of this criminality and fraud and treasonous behavior, especially during this kind of current arc of America's history, you have to go back to the starting point of this. And the starting point to that is 10 years ago, you had 2014, the one person speaking truth to power in our government was resigned. And then he subsequently started to advise several presidential candidates to let them know the system and how it works, and the good and the bad and the ugly. And then he happened to advise one that ended up securing the nomination for one of the major political parties. So then they decided, the system decided to go after that individual and then make sure that he was removed from the system from advising what ended up becoming the president, the 45th president of the United States. And I'm referring to what they did through the spying on General Flynn. 39 individuals that are on my deep state target list were the ones that participated in the unlawful unmasking of General Flynn. One of those 39 is a guy by the name of failed Vice President Joseph Robinette Giden, who used to be the failed senator from the state which I'm standing in, okay? Another one of those 39 was Sarah Raskin. Who's Sarah Raskin? The wife of Jamie Raskin, the guy that was appointed by Pelosi to go ahead and run the January 6th Fedsurrection cover-up operation in the form of, remember when the first phase of that cover-up operation was an impeachment, right? Impeachment hoax 2, some people call it. And then, since then, he coordinated, right, and helped develop and support Mike Pence's beloved Liz Cheney and Nancy Pelosi's beloved Benny Thompson's January 6th cover-up committee. Staff director being David Buckley that we talked about. And then CIA guy, former inspector general at the CIA for good old Johnny Boy Brennan. So to answer your question finally, after presenting that context, do we go after the DOJ? Yes, we go after the individuals within the DOJ that were complicit in this treason, right? Also, those that were former DOJ, current FBI, former FBI. I'll name some of the folks that are currently in the FBI that need retribution maximally. Number one is Brian Auten, A-U-T-E-N. He lives in Northern Virginia, last I checked. And another individual that needs to be scrutinized to the maximum at a minimum and brought into under sworn testimony is a guy. So Brian Auten was the senior intel analyst on Crossfire Hurricane. He then becomes the senior intel analyst at the Foreign Influence Task Force to coordinate the censorship regime from FBI headquarters. As his former colleague on Crossfire Hurricane, Joseph Pientka III, who was the ops guy, is then deployed over to the San Francisco field office to coordinate the censorship industrial complex with his boy Elvis Chan, who is listed in the Missouri v. Biden First Amendment censorship industrial complex lawsuit. And who else was there? Good old Jim Baker, the former general counsel at the FBI, who authorized the Crossfire Hurricane illegal spying operation and participating in the defrauding of the FISA court as they tried to get, they doctored the evidence presented before the FISA court to then spy on Carter Page. Completely doctored, manipulated. This is not my words. This is Horowitz. I mean, it's all documented internally. Next, Jim Baker is then deployed to Twitter 1.0 to be the number 2 lawyer as they develop this scheme to coordinate not only Twitter, but also the broader big tech ecosystem in San Francisco to go ahead and manage the cover-up, which was the Biden criminal syndicate, right, was ushered in through an unlawful election 39 states ran it illegally. Then they covered it up with a no quorum on January 6th. Look it up. Watch C-SPAN. There was no quorum that Pelosi and Mike Pence certified it unlawfully. And then they ushered in all of the measures to include the escalatory mandates. As a devout heterosexual, I don't do mandates. And many of my colleagues do not do mandates, okay? And so when we started looking into it, we looked at the legality of those mandates, and they're unlawful, all of them, because there was never an FDA-approved product that was created for distribution for consumption. The product that they approved purportedly was a labeling product known as originally Pfizer Comirnaty, but that thing was never produced, and thus you are not lawfully allowed to force experiment with emergency use authorized products on society nor the military. So Nuremberg 2.0, baby, it's not just a conspiracy theory. We are moving the nation towards guaranteeing maximum consequences for every single person that is on my deep state target list, to include a category separately known as the Nuremberg defendant category. And Anthony Fauci is at the very top of that list, and so is Mike Pence, due to his promulgation of all the policies that emanated from that White House coronavirus task force. What are your questions?
Yeah, wow. So many connections in Washington, D.C., all working together for a specific outcome. As a former Green Beret, what are your thoughts on the situation at the border? And is this an intentional invasion of the United States?
So I'll answer the second part of that question. I will say a resounding yes. It is a deliberate. So remember, when you contextualize, as we're standing outside the Biden criminal syndicate laptop and crimes trial right outside here, remember that 10% for the big guy came from the Chinese Communist Party, came from Ukraine, came from his deals with the Moscow mayor's wife. So all these boilerplate deals that took place were basically, I'll give you a little background. You said as a former Green Beret, as a former intel guy too. I served on the Ukraine crisis team in 2014 at the Pentagon within the National Military Command Center. And as I observed that, in my spare time as a personal private citizen off duty, I was kind of studying things as well. And what did I pick up? Good old, after John Brennan conducted the coup in Ukraine, he then sends over his failed vice president, Joseph Robinette Biden-Linsky, if you will, and then he does his deals so that his son can take in $1 million a year. That's $83,333.33, repeating a month, so that his son could then smoke crack, sniff cocaine, and then use that on his hookers and blow, right? And apparently that company that was teed up for him, good old Burisma, must have thought, you know what, the subject matter experience and expertise that this kid Hunter Biden has must be olfactory, because he could sniff out with his left nostril oil fields, right? And then with his right nostril, he could sniff out gas fields for that company. And maybe that's why they were paying that amount of money for him. It had nothing to do with the Biden criminal syndicate name brand, right? And I'm getting to a point here. So while 10% went to the big guy in a joint bank account between Hunter and his daddy, Joe, right? Uncle Joe. Where did that money come from? I just explained. So when you're tethered by the Chinese Communist Party in such a fashion, you are now a known agent of China. So I argue that every single federal officer and military service member currently working in our federal government must consider filing a Foreign Agent Registration Act filing as a sub-agent of China. Because guess what? If you consider this guy that's sitting in the White House to be a legitimately, lawfully, duly elected under the Electoral College, specifically Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 constitutional framework, then you need to file as a sub-agent of China. But for those of us that realize that there was never a lawful constitutional conduct of that 2020 election, because again, 39 states ran their elections under pandemic rules and not under the state's election law, which is required by Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, where the state legislatures are the ones that decide on the allocation of their presidential and vice presidential electors. Well, then those folks like that, you don't have to file because you don't consider this guy legitimate. Needless to say, kind of summarizing what you've asked so far, yes, we have to go after the folks within the DOJ that covered for this Biden criminal syndicate. Those in the former and current CIA that covered for the Biden criminal syndicate when they said that, oh, that laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation. And guess what? It was the same people in that ecosystem that were the analysts from the National Intelligence Council that said, oh, no, we can't submit the executive order requirement assessment on foreign interference in our elections, according to Executive Order 13848, where within 45 days after the election, then the intelligence community is supposed to provide a report to the president, to the vice president, and several other cabinet members of whether or not that there was foreign interference. Well, it was late when they presented it to the DNI Radcliffe. Why? Because it was the same John Brennan lackeys in the CIA that didn't want any mention of China interfering in the election. Because why? Because they're covering for the Biden criminal syndicate, folks. That's all I got. I mean, that's a superficial answer to your questions.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. What do you think really took place on January 6th? Because as more and more time goes on, we're realizing the crowd was manipulated. They were pushed in a certain direction. It appears nobody actually came there to enter the Capitol or do destruction, but all of a sudden chaos broke out. People behaved badly. What are your thoughts on what really happened that day?
Do me a favor, pull this up and screen share it.
Okay.
Title 2, United States Code, Section 1967. And then while you're at it, bring in Title 2, U.S. Code, Section 1979. When you read those two sections of that code, and I'm going to kind of contextualize it for you. Title 2 of the U.S. Code is referring to the creation of an organization, Chapter 29, that is, Title 2 U.S. Code, Chapter 29, refers to the creation of the United States Capitol Police. It discusses the Capitol Police Board, who appoints them, the creation, the leadership, the mission, the roles, responsibilities, jurisdiction, authorizations, all of that. So if you're a J6 defendant and you haven't read that, then you're derelict. If you're an attorney for those J6 defendants, you're absolutely derelict in your duties as an attorney. If you're a family member of the J6 defendants, and this includes Donald Trump and his Jackie Boy Smith trial, if you attorneys that represent Donald Trump have not looked at this, then you are derelict as attorneys. And you need to bring in attorneys that do know something about that. And that means that you need to understand the Capitol Police and the authority that had jurisdiction to criminalize, make all decision-related, well, first, law enforcement decisions as it applies to the run-up to January 6th, on January 6th, and then the criminal decision, the discretionary authority to decide who to criminalize as a result of the events of January 6th, which were, by the way, almost entirely unarmed, peaceful, First Amendment election justice rally attendees that were conducting their First Amendment both outside and inside of the United States Capitol, and in some instances facilitated into the Capitol. And you're asking the question, who was behind it? When you look at the authority, it is the Capitol Police Board that decides on whether to allow other entities onto the Capitol grounds to protect the Capitol. I'm referring to executive branch entities known as the DC National Guard, the FBI, the DHS's Customs and Border Patrol HSI agents, the DC Metropolitan Police undercovers, and confidential human sources for those entities that I just mentioned. Meaning, the Speaker of the House, Pelosi, is the one that directs the House Sergeant at Arms, who's on the Capitol Police Board. And then it is Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, that directs his Senate Sergeant at Arms to then control the Capitol Police Board, to then direct what the Capitol Police does as it applies to January 6th. Well, what happened? It was Nancy Pelosi and her Sergeant at Arms, Paul Irving, who happened to be the Sergeant at Arms for John Boehner and Paul Ryan before that, who both of them said, hey, Chief Sund, due to optics, we're not going to have any D.C. National Guard. We're going to reject any executive branch protection of the Capitol, even though Chief Sund requested on 6 occasions from January 3rd to January 6th that particular request. Secondarily, the head of Intelligence and Interagency Coordination Division at U.S. Capitol Police, Yogananda Pittman, was the one that did not provide the intelligence that would have probably given the impetus for Chief Sund to go before the Capitol Police Board for a 7th time to say, hey, if something happens, I have intel supporting that I need support, and you're refusing it. And then that would have been a debacle. She failed to release that information. I wonder why, Nancy Pelosi, that took place. Tarek Johnson says that good old Yogananda Pittman, this is not my words. This is Tarek Johnson, U.S. Capitol Police whistleblower, says it was Yogananda, and he spent almost 23 years on the U.S. Capitol Police, and then as a lieutenant, he was forced out for speaking truth to power. Yogananda Pittman, he said, is very close with the Congressional Black Freedom Caucus, or was it Black Caucus? Now, you make your own conclusions from there, but last I checked, they're very closely aligned with the Democrats, right? So when you control the Capitol Police Board, and the run-up to the Capitol, I guess, facilitated breach intentionally by Yogi Pittman, Paul Irving, and Nancy Pelosi, and what comes out of it? It is possible that the head of Intel, which failed, that I just mentioned, and Interagency Coordination Division, was the one that interagency coordinated with those federal actors that incited, that instigated, that facilitated the breach of the Capitol. And then in order to create, through their surrogate media allies, some of which, I'm going to flip the video here, some of which are right in front of us here. Let's go ahead and take a look at who some of these are. Right here. Some of the same individuals involved in promulgating that there was an insurrection, is what Nancy Pelosi wanted you to believe. Well, it was a surrection. It was a Nancy-rection, meaning a Fedsurrection parliamentary coup where she facilitated through her discretionary control of the Capitol Police Board and the Capitol Police leadership, who she'd known for decades, in order to facilitate that breach into the Capitol, create the frame for an insurrection, and then have the general counsel of the U.S. Capitol Police, Tadpole DeBias, his name should be, but his real name is Thomas DeBias, Aquinas DeBias, Aquinas is his middle name. Yeah, and I got all these people's names, numbers, addresses, etc. I'm not going to dox them, but if you want to reach out to me individually, who's listening in, or you, Stephen, I can provide each one of those if you would like to, whatever. If you want to file a lawsuit or whatever, that's going to be easy. But bottom line, as it relates to January 6th, it was a Fedsurrection parliamentary coup, both on the inside and on the outside of the Capitol. On the inside, they refused. Let me give you a little context that I normally don't. Inside of the United States Capitol on January 6th, you had Nancy Pelosi coordinating in an agreement with McCarthy, Schumer, and McConnell to only allow 11 members of each party and of each cameral of the House and Senate to participate, to be on the floor during the joint session. Half of which were agreed to be those that were in support of objecting on the Republican side, and half of those to be those that were against supporting the objections. That is Kevin McCarthy agreeing to those rules, meaning half of them would only provide 5 minutes of debate to say, no, we shouldn't object. So then 75% of those that speak are already saying not to object, right?
Okay.
In addition, there was no quorum. So there was the constitutional requirement under the 12th Amendment is that there's 2/3 of the states that are represented from the House and 2/3 of the senators are represented from the Senate. That did not take place. Who was complicit in that decision? All four bipartisan, bicameral leaders. McConnell, Schumer in the Senate, Pelosi, McCarthy in the House. So 12th Amendment was violated. And then that was going on. Meanwhile, on the outside, you had this deliberate, facilitated, incited, instigated breach of the Capitol that then changed into the frame of, once they got enough content to call it an insurrection through their media ally scum to include faux news. Remember, the board member is Paul Ryan, so he was facilitating that. And it was Paul Ryan's sergeant at arms, who was Nancy's sergeant at arms as well, that was the one that facilitated on behalf of Nancy to go ahead and facilitate the breach. Due to optics, they didn't have any protection of the Capitol, right? No one talks about that because Paul Ryan's not going to want you to know about this because it implicates him over at Faux News. MSLSD doesn't want you to talk about this because Jim Comey and Andy McCabe are the ones that are promulgating the whole, the biggest, worst crime in history, right? It was the most biggest bloodshed moment in American and world history when, in reality, 4 peaceful and unarmed election justice rally attendees were slaughtered. Number 1, Ashley Babbitt, by promoted to captain. Michael Byrd, U.S. Capitol Police officer, murdered her. Number 2, D.C. Metropolitan Police Officer Roseanne Boylan, and maybe others, were the ones that brutally bludgeoned and murdered Roseanne Boylan. And then 2 other folks that died, Benjamin Phillips and Kevin Greason. And oh, by the way, good old Officer Brian Sicknick, the coroner in D.C., by the way, Muriel Bowser's coroner, basically said that the guy died from natural causes. Was it the Moderna mutilation natural cause of death or the Pfizer fail natural cause of death for Officer Brian Sicknick? It is unknown. These are questions that need to be answered. But no, they led us to believe that there was a fire extinguisher that came out of nowhere and miraculously somehow created the natural cause of death, according to the radical leftist mayor's coroner from D.C.
Yeah, that story is just sick. Okay, final question.
I don't know if I answered your question, but I went on a little Raiklin rant.
Final question. I appreciate you coming on. This morning, Judge Eileen Cannon in Florida said she wants to do a sidebar investigation on whether Special Prosecutor Jack Smith even has authority or was appointed correctly. Now she's starting to believe this whole thing is a sham, and she wants to investigate it and possibly end the entire lawsuit. What do you know about that?
So this is the first I'm hearing about it from you, but Judge Eileen Cannon, if you're listening in, those that are friends and relatives of this distinguished judge, I would venture to say the following First Amendment sound. Jack Smith, his evidence, when you look at his indictment of President Trump, in line 88, page 32, it talks about that President Trump retweeted a tweet known as Operation Pence Card, where it called on the vice president to not allow the illegally transmitted electors to be received by the presiding officer, president of the Senate, meaning the vice president. That was in his criminal indictment. And where did he get that language, Jackie Boy Smith, that is? He got it from the Mike Pence's January 6th cover-up committee that Liz Cheney led. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, through her beloved Benny Thompson, led that January 6th Fedsurrection cover-up committee. And where did they get that from? During the 3rd hearing, they mentioned that an individual by the name of Ivan Raiklin tweeted out that President Trump retweeted. But guess what? What I'm getting at, 2 points. 1, everything at Jack Smith that he's doing is based on the work of David Buckley, of Liz Cheney, of Benny Thompson, of Nancy Pelosi, and Mike Pence. That trial is based on those individuals' political vendetta to kick President Trump out of office, right? And number two, why aren't these scum calling me in? Hey, Jackie Boy Smith, why aren't you calling me in to then present to you all of the evidence that I have in the form of text messages and email exchanges and phone calls of me communicating with, Kevin McCarthy and Mike Pence's Chief of Staff, Mark Short, as I laid out what they were obligated to do on January 6th, and in addition to what they were obligated to do on December 23rd of 2020, a total separate legal theory that they somehow confound with January 6th. These scum, complete retards have no understanding of a calendar. December 23rd. Now, just for your audience and you, Stephen, would you consider December 23rd of 2020 a different day than January 6th of 2021?
Yes.
Would you consider it a different month?
Yes.
And would you consider it a different year?
Yes.
Wow. Ding, ding, ding. You are smarter by leaps and bounds than the absolute retard Jackie Boy Smith and his entire team. And you're smarter than the entire January 6th Fedsurrection Cover-Up Committee, to include all those that mentioned my name. And that includes all these legacy scum that reported on it, to include Roytards is one of them, Washington Compost another, and New Woke Slimes another one, as well as, Raw Sewage, some of the other ones that are out there. What did they say? Oh, this Pence card memo was something related to January 6th. It had nothing to do with January 6th. It was Mike Pence's obligation under Title III U.S. Code Section 12 of the Electoral Count Act and what he was supposed to do. And on January 6th, Ivan Raiklin's theory is another second one, separate one, that was in the form of communicating with Kevin McCarthy in his role as the majority state delegation chair. We're 27 states under that framework. Look it up under the 12th Amendment, where 27 states were Republican, 20 were Democrat, 3 were tied up by delegation. I communicated a strategy to McCarthy as well as Mike Pence's Chief of Staff, Mark Short, to go ahead on January 6th, vote by state delegation on the objection. And then you would trigger a contingent election, thus creating a in the most easiest fashion possible and constitutional legal, that is, re-election. But what did they decide to do? Nancy Pelosi decided to do her Nancy-rection, and since then they've been covering it up. And that's why they don't call me in. If you saw my video, they bring me in, the entire regime crumbles, because then I now have these scum reporting on my involvement and all the details related to January 6th. So in essence, January 6th is the creation of Nancy Pelosi in response to my articulation online on Twitter through that tweet. And then more importantly, when I had recommended and said it in last couple days into January 6th podcast, because at that point, after several Trump retweets, I was being noticed and observed. When they saw that this was a constitutional path for a re-election, the only method that they could stop it would be to facilitate an incited and instigated breach into the Capitol so that they could create the narrative of an insurrection and then bring in toxic, feckless, stone-cold, coward, gutless simps like Kelly Loeffler to believe that it was an insurrection, like Mr. Senator Perdue also, or folks such as Congressman Mike Waltz that changed his mind on objecting on January 5th, and he changed his mind to not object on January 6th. Had we had no Fedsurrection, there would have been increasing momentum, and I would have given it at that point. My last interview that I did the day prior, I think it was a 50-50 shot at that point, whether or not that there was going to be a President Trump re-election or not, depending on how Kevin McCarthy and Mike Pence acted in holding the vote by state delegation in the House. That would have been for McCarthy to do. And then Pelosi would have presented that with McCarthy's vote to the presiding officer in conflict. You would have had Democrats saying, no, don't object to the Biden electors. You would have had the state delegation saying, yes, we're objecting to the Biden electors. And then it would have been up to the presiding officer to make a ruling. And then all he would have had to do is look at the language of the 12th Amendment and say, yes, the 12th Amendment allows for it. And the Electoral Count Act is silent on this decision. So then it would have been up to the beloved toxic, feckless, stone cold coward, gutless simp, COVID task force lead from the White House, Mikey Pence, to make the decision on whether or not to allow the state delegation vote or the one person, one vote style vote from the House to take place. And that would have resulted in a re-election had he gone with the McCarthy option.
Interesting. Okay, one final question, then I'll let you go. I know you got to get back into to support Hunter Biden.
Oh, breaking news. Wait, breaking news before I forget. This is totally breaking. So Hunter Biden, his attorney is Abbe Lowell, right?
Yes.
If you recall back a few months ago, when Abbe Lowell brought his crack baby client into the House of Representatives, making a nice little charade facade, and then when Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene started to ask questions of crack baby, cocaine addict, good. I mean, there's so many crimes. Treason is obviously one of them. But Biden walks out with Abbe Lowell. And as they're in the hallway, a guy by the name of Ivan Raiklin asks, very professionally, very cordially, in a very controlled demeanor, Mr. Biden, what kind of crack do you smoke, Mr. Biden? And Abbe Lowell didn't like that because it interrupted his press conference. And oh, by the way, you don't get to decide who gets to speak in the halls of Congress. Okay, Abbe? And so I wanted to remind Abbe, when I was up there on the 4th floor as he exited the courtroom, I said, hey, Abbe. He walked up to me. I was just going to say hi, Abbe. He walks up to me. He's like, hey, do I know you? I put out my hand. He shakes my hand and says, yeah, my name's Ivan Raiklin. I'm the guy that asked your client what kind of crack he smokes a few months ago. And then he walked away. And he's like, oh, who do you work for? I'm like, I work for myself, private citizen Ivan Raiklin. And he said, we'll see about that. Huh? We'll see about that, Abbe, huh? Wow. We will see about you, Abbe.
Oh, wow.
And oh, by the way, as I'm out here speaking, every single member of the media, legacy media, can hear every single thing that I'm saying.
Yes.
Because I'm out here in the courtyard. Look at that strategic messaging in communications.
Yeah, they can't not listen. Well, Ivan, thank you so much. Thank you for your boldness. Continue to be in their face and bring out the truth. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to get this going today, and I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, please drop that today. And if I can ask somebody in the audience, crop that last part of the Abbe Lowell piece, and I want to get that sent to him directly as a reminder of who I am, because he seemed to forget.
Okay. Hey, thank you for coming on.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate you.